Do you know how to maximize your winnings at live low-stakes poker? Well, it's certainly not by battling the best rags in your game or by applying perfect GTO concepts. The key to a bigger win rate is knowing how to exploit your opponents. And in this video, I'm going to show you 5 of my favorite exploits for live low-stakes poker. Every student of mine who has implemented these managed to increase their hourly rate at 1-2 and 1-3 live. If you master these, you will be a big winner in your games too. Especially the last one can be massive. It is the one exploit that pretty much doubled my win rate when I first started to do it consistently. Okay, so for the first one, I'd like to look at an example hand from a 1-2 game with effective stacks of $400. We raise our pocket jacks in the cutoff to 15 over 3 limpers, only the first limper calls. The flop is 10-8-4 rainbow. We make a continuation bet of $25 into the pot of 37. The limper calls. The turn is an innocuous looking offsuit deuce. We go for more value and bet $60. The limper waits for a few seconds and then raises to $150. We're getting more than 3-1, we have an overpair, so it looks like an easy call, right?
Wrong.
Let's just rewind the hand. The guy is a limper. He wants to see a cheap flop. He's not an aggressive maniac who pushes people around. He check-called a fairly big bet on the flop, so he probably has at least a pair or a very good draw. And now he puts in $150 as a check raise on the turn. Ask yourself, would he do that with a hand like ace-10? I wouldn't completely rule it out, but it seems unlikely. First of all, he might have raised that hand pre-flop, and secondly, he could have check-raised the flop with that hand rather than waiting until the turn. Can he have a bluff? Again, I can't rule it out, but he could have bluffed on the flop. It seems odd that a passive limper risks $150 on the turn with a straight draw after he was super passive before. So the most likely type of hand would be a set that he slow played on the flop. This spot is one of the clearest folds at live low stakes poker that you will ever see. Sure, a solver would probably fist pump call here, but in real life, this would be absolute spew. So my first favorite exploit is overfold to raises on later streets. Exploit number 2 is quite similar, even though there is a different pattern that you have to recognize. Let's compare two very quick scenarios. Here, villain is the preflop aggressor. We just called preflop in the big blind. There's $11 in the middle, and he now overbets $12 on the flop. I'm not saying that we should call or fold, it is just about what we think of this bet. And I think that this is probably a good hand that wants protection on a wet board. It can be the nuts, but it could just be a vulnerable top pair. And it could even be a bluff. And now let's look at the same villain in a different hand. Here we are on the river. There's $400 in the pot, and villain now bets $225. This is just over half pot, so you could think that it means that villain has a weaker hand than in the previous example. But this is totally different in what it means. A recreational player who bets $225 at any point in a hand means business. This is not a weak top pair that wants to find out where it stands. This is the nuts or close to the nuts. And here is the exploit. While in GTO terms, it's all about the percentage of the pot for recreational players, it is about the absolute value of the money. $225 even into a $600 pot would be a more significant bet than $12 into a pot of $11. So always keep this in mind when you face a big bet in monetary terms that actually doesn't look that much percentage-wise. But sometimes you need to be careful even with bets that are much smaller, like in this example. You raise to $5 with ace-jack offsuit in the hijack. The button calls. The flop is ace-7 deuce rainbow. You bet $7 into the pot of 13, he calls. The turn is an offsuit 10, you bet $20 into the pot of 27, he calls again. The river is a brick. You now decide to take it slowly and check. Villain bets $50 into the pot of 67. I bet your initial reaction is to call. You have top pair with a good kicker after all. But think again. Villain called a bet on the flop and then another one on the turn. What do you think he would do this with? Well, there are no draws there, so he has to have at least a pair. It doesn't need to be a pair of aces, but he would not call twice without at least a pair of some sort. And when we check on the river, do you think he will bet $50 with a pair of sevens? Sure, it is not impossible. Some players do that, but it seems unlikely. He could have an ace, but would he really bet an ace with a weak kicker after you bet the flop and the turn? Again, not impossible, but in my experience, recreational players don't go for thin value bets. They are super happy to check behind with top pair. So what does he have then? I think this is at least two pair, if not a set. He had position throughout the hand, and the board was never too wet, so he didn't have to raise at any point. And now he wants to get thick value on the river. So this is a mandatory fold against typical recreational players at live poker. Here's what you could do instead. Just bet the river yourself, bet third pot, and he will call you with a weaker top pair, potentially even with the 7 if he doesn't believe you. But don't check call the river after you had the betting lead. Exploit number 4 is the easiest exploit ever, but so many players butcher this one. Here's an example. There are 5 limbs and we just check our option with Queen Jack offsuit in the big blind. The flop comes Queen Jack deuce. We check and the player behind us bets $10. Everyone calls, including us. The turn brings in another queen. We now have the nuts. We check. The player behind us bets $30. Everyone calls again, including us. The river is a 6. We check, and everyone else checks behind. We win a pot of $210 minus the rake. Sounds great, but look how much more we could have won. We were all $400 deep. I think we could have gotten at least another $200. So why did Hero miss out on that money? Because he was terrified that everyone would fold if he raised at any point. But let's rewind the hand. On the flop, everyone calls the $10, which means that they all have something. Just raise to $50 and at least 2 players will call you. And the same on the turn, you absolutely have to raise. If someone else has a queen, they will not fold. If someone has an open-ended straight draw, they will not fold. It's possible that someone with a jack might even call you. In live low-stakes poker, where you don't need to worry about being balanced, just fast play your hands. Sure, sometimes everyone will fold and you'll feel like an idiot. But your goal is to maximize winnings against players who have a hand rather than trying to make peanuts from players who have ace high or a weak pair. And now let's talk about the most important small stakes exploit. Here's a great example of this play. I raised ace-10 suited to 10 over a limper. Big blind and limper called. The flop comes 10-4 deuce, all hearts. I have top pair, so I will go for a continuation bet against passive players. Both call. The turn is an offsuit 9. At this point, I have to slow down, so I check behind. And then the river is an offsuit jack. Really not a great card from my hand. Now, a flush beats me, 2 pair beat me, a set beats me, and simply a jack beats me. But the thing is, how often do these players have a flush after they kept checking? Not very often. Sure, a set or 2 pair might play very passively on this board, but what about a jack? They could have the jack of hearts and maybe even jack 10. So if we bet this river, we don't expect to always get called by a weaker hand. We will sometimes get called and we will lose. And this is exactly why most players would happily check back in this spot. And I think that that is a mistake at live low stakes. Going for thin value is a bread and butter play. If you don't find these bets routinely on the river, you will leave tons of money on the table.
But Andreas, what if I get raised after I bet?
I hear you say. That is the other fear players often have, but it is actually really easy. Do you think that someone who limp called pre-flop and called the flop will now start bluffing you? No, if they missed whatever draw they had, they will usually fold. And if they have middle pair, they will either call or fold, but they won't turn it into a bluff. If you get check raised in this spot, it is an easy fold. So if you want to increase your win rate, use exploit number 5, which is bet for thin value on the river and fold to raises. Oh, and in this hand, I bet 25, big blind called me with a weaker hand. If you remember these 5 exploits, you will do very well in small stakes cash games. But if you want to take your game to the next level, then you have to avoid the 5 mistakes I talked about in this video here.